In her 70s, Eleanor Roosevelt still possessed the vitality and enthusiasm that characterized her whole career in public life. For more than 30 years, she had set an exhausting pace for herself, touring the nation and the world on behalf of people in distress. Her enemy was suffering, wrote one reporter, and her cause was humanity. But Eleanor Roosevelt never saw herself as an idealist. My work provided me with an opportunity, she said, for living life as fully and deeply as I possibly could. Born in 1884, Anna Eleanor Roosevelt is a shy and retiring little girl. Says her mother, she's so plain-looking, such a funny, old-fashioned child that we call her Granny. When Eleanor is 8 years old, her mother is fatally by diphtheria. She clings to her father for affection. But within 2 years, Elliot Roosevelt dies. A lonely, insecure child, she is sent to live with her grandmother. I was made to feel, she would say later, that nothing about me would attract attention or admiration. Occasionally, Eleanor is permitted to visit the summer home of her dynamic uncle, Theodore Roosevelt, already a prominent figure in American politics.
First thing I remember is that he was horrified that I didn't know how to swim. So he thought he'd teach me as he taught all his own children, and he threw me in. And then he fished me out and lectured me on being frightened.
She makes her formal entrance into New York society in 1902. I was the first girl in my family, she recalls, who was not a belle, and I was deeply ashamed. At a fashionable ball, she meets a fifth cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin, a senior at Harvard College, launches a whirlwind courtship. I was only 19, but when Franklin asked me to marry him, it seemed entirely natural that I should say yes. And then she adds, it would be years before I understood what being in love, or loving, really meant. Sarah Roosevelt, Franklin's strong-willed and possessive mother, objects to the marriage, but young Franklin refuses to give up the idea. In the fall of 1904, Sarah Roosevelt reluctantly announces her son's engagement. Their wedding is attended by the President of the United States.
When Uncle Ted left us and went into another room, everybody eloped. It was really much more important that Uncle Ted was there than that we were being married.
For the first years of my marriage, Eleanor says, my mother-in-law did everything for me. It never occurred to revolt, she admits. I did whatever was required of me, hoping it would bring me the approval and love I so much wanted. Franklin, a successful young lawyer, decides to enter politics, and in the spring of 1910, he runs for a seat in the New York Senate. After his election, Eleanor says simply and naively, I will learn about politics. It is a wife's duty to be interested in whatever interests her husband. In 1920, James Cox, Democratic candidate for the presidency, selects the dynamic young Franklin Roosevelt as his running mate. The whistle-stop campaigning fascinates Eleanor, but she remains in the background, fearful of the crowds, the noise and excitement of public appearances.
Frank learned a great deal. He wasn't a very good speaker in those early days. There would be horrible long pauses, and I would wonder whether he was ever going on again. But he learned. He was very young and arrogant when he started out in public life, and he learned a great deal as he went along.
When the Democratic ticket is defeated, the Roosevelts resume the comfortable pattern of their life. They spend the summer of 1921 at the Pleasant Island resort of Campobello. But here, Eleanor Roosevelt will face one of the crises of her life, when her husband is suddenly and tragically stricken by infantile paralysis. The family is told that for the rest of his life, Roosevelt's legs will be paralyzed. His mother urges Roosevelt to dismiss all thoughts of continuing his political career. She wants him to retire to the life of a country squire, convinced that the most insignificant physical strain will cause his health to break entirely. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Roosevelt begins to fight for her convictions. With Roosevelt's political aide, Louis Howe, she wages a determined campaign to convince FDR that he must not give up.
Louis Howe wanted him to continue his interest in politics, and so he decided that I'd better go into the state political setup in New York so as to bring people into the house more and keep my husband's interest up. And so Louis Howe used to go with me to meetings and sit in the back and make fun of me afterwards, which was quite painful but very good for me because I would never have learned to speak otherwise.
In 1928, Democratic presidential candidate Al Smith convinces Roosevelt that he should run for governor of New York. Roosevelt wins the election by an overwhelming majority. Writes a reporter, "The victory is a tribute to his personal courage and to the determination of the woman standing beside him." At the age of 44, Eleanor Roosevelt finds that the pattern of her life has changed. She has become involved in a great many political organizations and charity projects, and she discovers that the activity is exciting and stimulating. Never before has she felt needed by people outside of her home and family. For Eleanor, it is an exhilarating and rewarding experience. Franklin Roosevelt reaches the peak of his political career in 1932 when he is nominated as the Democratic candidate for President of the United States. Eleanor joins him as he campaigns across a depression-racked America, seeking support for the New Deal. A mature, forceful woman, she is no longer the awkward, timid wife who campaigned beside her husband a dozen years ago. FDR is elected by one of the greatest majorities of modern times. Writes Eleanor Roosevelt, "I was happy for my husband, but for myself I was deeply troubled. As I saw it, this would mean the end of any personal life of my own." March 1933. Eleanor Roosevelt is swept up in the whirlwind of activity surrounding the first days of Franklin Roosevelt's administration. From the very beginning, Mrs. Roosevelt makes it clear that she intends to be more than a mere ornament on the White House reception line. She is sent on a tour of the country by FDR. He wants her to serve as his eyes and legs. "Look at the clothes on the wash line," he tells Eleanor. "Look at the cars and see whether the house needs painting. Talk to the people and tell me what they're thinking." She learns the problems of national labor organizations in her talks with union members. And in the years to come, she will actively support labor's demands for improved working conditions. She sees inadequate housing for the aged during her tours and begins working on a program to remedy the problem. She has an insatiable curiosity, an inexhaustible supply of energy, and a genuine affection for all kinds of people. Says Mrs. Roosevelt, "It was the best education I ever received."
I'm very glad to be back, and we've had a perfectly delightful trip and enjoyed every minute of it.
She seems to be perpetually on the move. Writes a weary reporter traveling with her, "Please make Eleanor tired, just for one day." Everything Eleanor Roosevelt says and does becomes news. True to her prediction, her personal life is no longer her own. Instead, she is becoming an American institution. Even the clothes she wears are a subject of national interest. Soon, in addition to being the first wife of a president ever to hold her own weekly press conference, she writes a daily syndicated newspaper column called My Day. An accomplished horsewoman, she crowds an occasional morning ride into her hectic schedule. In these days, she recalls, I was afraid to go to sleep for fear I would miss something. Her wide-ranging activities begin to involve her in controversial national issues. When Marian Anderson is denied the right to sing in Constitution Hall because she is a Negro, Eleanor Roosevelt arranges for the concert to be held in front of the Lincoln Memorial. For the remainder of her life, she will continue to be an outspoken champion in the cause of equal civil rights for all people. She is called on by congressional committees to testify about her public statements.
Blue Plains was our conception of health care for the aged.
Her formal education had prepared her only for acceptance in high society. But the practical education of the past decade has given her a working knowledge about national and world affairs. Eleanor's relationship with FDR has matured through the years. She says, he might have been happier with a wife who was completely uncritical. Nevertheless, I acted as a spur, even though spurring was not welcome. I was one of those, she adds, who served his purpose. Between the two, there exists not only a lasting bond of affection, but a deep and abiding respect for one another. It is 1942. Once again, she has become the eyes and legs of FDR, reporting to him not about a depression-riddled nation, but about a war-torn world. Traveling under the code name Rover, she visits combat areas and makes it a point to stop at every hospital. Says one battle-toughened admiral, watching the faces of those kids light up when she talked to them made you know that she was the best medicine they could have had. Franklin Roosevelt is elected to an unprecedented fourth term as president late in 1944. But the strain of 12 years in the White House has already begun to tell. On April 12th, a terse, tragic bulletin is issued from the White House. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is dead. As the nation mourns the passing of the president, Eleanor Roosevelt attempts to put into words feelings expressed. Of her husband, she says, if at the end one can say that this man used to the limit the powers that God granted him in order to achieve what he deemed to be his task, then that life has been lived well, and there are no regrets. Looking back over her own life for the past 12 years, she adds, I think I lived these years impersonally. It was almost as if I had erected someone outside of myself. But at last, even that is over. I am now on my own. In December 1945, President Truman asks Eleanor Roosevelt to accept an appointment as a United States delegate to the United Nations.
I knew I would have to do the very best I could because I was the only woman on the delegation, and it would be letting all women who might in the future have this opportunity down if I didn't do well.
The delegate from Chile, Mr. Del Rio, has sent Mr. Santa Cruz, who will sit in his place all the way through. And from China, Dr. Chang is here. From France, Professor Cassin is here. From
At the
Lebanon,
United
Dr.
Nations,
Valley.
she is assigned the chairmanship of the apparently unimportant Committee 3, dealing with the broad area of human rights.
Represented by Professor Vladimir Koretsky, who is here, and we welcome him.
I will
Suddenly, however, the committee is catapulted to prominence by a controversy stemming from the question of European refugees.
I recognize the delegate from the USSR.
Господин председатель, между пятой прошлогодней
The Soviet Union insists that displaced persons be forced to return to their own nations. Eleanor Roosevelt leads the fight to give the refugees the freedom to choose their new homeland. Time and again, she clashes with Russian delegates in the committee.
Китайской Народной Республики.
It is my ruling as chairman of the commission that the point raised by the Soviet member is out of order. The Soviet member or anyone else on the commission may of course appeal against this ruling. If anyone does appeal against the ruling, I will immediately submit the ruling to the vote.
Finally, the issue is brought before the General Assembly, and Mrs. Roosevelt must debate the question with Russia's Andrei Vyshinsky. She rallies enough support from the uncommitted nations to swing the vote in favor of giving world refugees the right to make their own decisions. After the debate, American delegate Senator Arthur Vandenberg tells her, "We fought to keep you off the delegation, but we must now acknowledge that we have found you good to work with. We will be happy to do so again." She tours refugee camps in post-war Europe. Appalled by the suffering, she becomes more determined than ever to provide help for these people. Eleanor Roosevelt is the driving force behind the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
This Universal Declaration of Human Rights may well become the international Magna Carta of all men everywhere. We hope its proclamation by the General Assembly will be an event comparable to the proclamation of the Declaration of the Rights of Man by the French people in 1789, the adoption of the Bill of Rights by the people of the United States, and the adoption of comparable declarations at different times in other countries. Man's desire for peace lies behind this declaration. The realization that the flagrant violation of human rights by Nazi and fascist countries sowed the seeds of the last World War has supplied the impetus for the work. Man must have freedom in which to develop his full stature and through common effort to raise the level of human dignity.
She continues to travel restlessly across the nation and the world, wherever she feels she can fill a need or lend a hand. Her warmth and sincerity inspire faith in the people she meets. Her genuine interest in their problems gives added meaning to her plea for brotherhood and peace. Writes a friend, in her womanliness, she has a heart that never hardens, a touch that never hurts, and a smile that never tires. Though controversy still swirls around her outspoken views on international relations, she answers her critics by saying, "When I feel I am right, it seems to me that I cannot afford, as a self-respecting individual, to refuse to do a thing." It is a remarkable statement from a woman who once said, "I could not rebel for the thought of losing someone's love and attention." In 1960, Eleanor Roosevelt is once again involved in a political campaign, urging Democrats to nominate Adlai Stevenson for president. Her belief in and her support for him had not wavered through two unsuccessful campaigns. He is, she maintains, the best man for the job. Stevenson is defeated at the Democratic convention, and Eleanor lends her support to the successful candidate, John Kennedy. "This is the last time I'm ever going to campaign," she insists. "After all, next time I will be 80, and that would be absurd." Within a year, however, she will accept a Kennedy appointment as a delegate to the United Nations. She ruefully admits that it takes a great deal of effort to maintain her busy schedule, and says with a trace of sadness, "I suppose I must slow down." October 31st, 1962. Adlai Stevenson is summoned to Eleanor Roosevelt's New York apartment. He sadly tells reporters that she is gravely ill with a rare form of tuberculosis. A week-long bedside vigil ends on November 7, 1962. Eleanor Roosevelt is dead at the age of 78. The entire world mourns the passing of Eleanor Roosevelt. As a young girl, she had sought affection and admiration. At her death, it is apparent that perhaps no individual in modern history is so universally admired and loved. Adlai Stevenson delivers a final, eloquent eulogy to Eleanor Roosevelt.
The sadness we share is enlivened by the faith in her fellow man and his future, which filled the heart of this strong and gentle woman. She imparted this faith not only to those who shared the privilege of knowing her and working by her side, but to countless men, women, and children in every part of the world who loved her even as she loved them. For she embodied the vision and the will to achieve a world in which all men can walk in peace and dignity. And to this goal of a better life, she dedicated her tireless energy and the strange strength of her extraordinary personality. She would rather light candles than curse the darkness, and her glow had warmed the world.
On April 23, 1963, the President of the United States signs a congressional act chartering the Eleanor Roosevelt Memorial Foundation. Says President Kennedy, "An institution is the lengthened shadow of a great individual. I am sure the Eleanor Roosevelt Memorial Foundation will reflect the wisdom, energy, concern for the poor, and advancement of public health, economic welfare, and international goodwill that Mrs. Roosevelt showed throughout her life. The foundation should cast a long shadow indeed." A foundation dedicated to the ideals by which she lived is a fitting memorial for Eleanor Roosevelt. She could never find contentment while others were in distress, wrote Adlai Stevenson. This was not sacrifice. This, for Mrs. Roosevelt, was the only meaningful way of life.